lesson for October 31st is entitled Resolving Painful Relationships. The key verse is from Genesis 31, verse 3, which says, "Then the Lord said to Jacob, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." The scripture is from Genesis 31, verses 1 through 3, 26 through 29, 41 and 42, and 51 through 55. The lesson focus is the reality of conflict underscores the value of the art of conflict resolution. In the overview, it says that friction was certainly a part of the relationship between Jacob and Laban. Both of them tried to use the other for their own advantage, and both were offended by the other's actions. When God called Jacob back to his native land, he had to confront the broken relationships he had with Laban and with his brother Esau. When trying to obey God, we too must face the necessity of mending broken relationships. Since there are no perfect people, there are no perfect relationships. Whenever two people are in relationship, there is a need for forgiveness, patience, conflict resolution. What is necessary in marriage, family, church, and all other relationships is the ability to work through the bumps and bruises of life together and to be able to experience and offer God's blessing. Are we more concerned with receiving a blessing or being a blessing in our relationships? What causes conflicts in our relationships, and what hinders us from resolving them? What blessings or commitments are being hindered by unresolved conflicts in our relationships? In part 1, it says to return to the starting point, and the text is from Genesis 31, verses 1 through 3, which says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Go back to the land of your fathers, and to your relatives, and I will be with you. It had been 2 decades since Jacob left his father's home to look for a wife from among his mother's relatives. He had worked 14 years for the 2 daughters of Laban, Rebekah's brother. He then worked 6 years caring for Laban's flocks. During this time, God had blessed Jacob with abundant herds and flocks of his own. Now there was conflict building between Jacob, Laban, and Laban's sons. The Lord spoke to Jacob and said, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. The Lord spoke to Jacob again and said, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go to your native land. This call to return to his native land was significant in 3 ways. First, Jacob was to return to the place of blessing, the land of your fathers. God was calling Jacob to go back to the land that was promised to his grandfather Abraham and to his descendants. It was the place where Jacob received his father's blessing. Second, Jacob was to return to the place of consecration, where you anointed a pillar. Bethel was where Jacob spent the night on his way to Padan Aram, where Laban lived. Jacob had a dream and then made a vow, stating that if God would take care of him so that he would return safely to his father's house, then the Lord would be his God. Third, Jacob was to return to the place of reconciliation, to your relatives. He had taken his brother Esau's birthright and blessing. He had tricked his father into blessing him instead of Esau. Now he would have to face Isaac and Esau. When Jacob had left, Esau was determined to kill him. Sometimes in the process of life, we drift from our relationship with the Lord. Problems, people, and even prosperity can slowly bring barriers that separate us from an awareness of God's presence. It may be a place or just a memory But God may call us back to the place of blessing and consecration. God often calls us back before He leads us forward. God's blessing and our consecration are experienced in the reality of imperfect relationships. When two people are more interested in receiving a blessing than being a blessing, friction will exist in their relationship. In part 2, it says that friction produces heat. The text is from Genesis 31, verses 26 through 39, and verses 41 and 42, which says, Then Laban said to Jacob, What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me, so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night He rebuked you. During the 20 years Jacob was with Laban and his family, there were many conflicts. From Laban's perspective, everything Jacob was taking from Padan Aram was his. Jacob's wives were his daughters, their children were his grandchildren, and Jacob had gotten his flocks from Laban's flocks. He was offended because Jacob didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. Laban wasn't even given the opportunity to have a going-away party with his family. Laban told Jacob, You've deceived me, and you carried off my daughters like captives in war. According to Laban, he had every reason to be offended by Jacob's behavior. Jacob had a different perspective on what had happened. Jacob told Laban, I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. According to the context, these wage changes were not cost of living increases or merit raises. From Jacob's perspective, if it had not been for God's blessing, Laban surely would have sent him away empty-handed. Jacob had worked 7 years for Rachel, but Laban substituted Leah. After working another 7 years for Rachel, Jacob told Laban he was leaving. Laban asked Jacob to stay and take care of his flocks. Laban had a right to be upset with Jacob. No one would want their children and grandchildren to move away without the opportunity to say goodbye. What Laban failed to remember was that Jacob had tried to say goodbye and leave appropriately 6 years earlier, and Laban asked him to stay because God was blessing him because of Jacob. Jacob was obeying God's call in his life to return to his native land. Laban and his sons were upset with him. It was time for him to take his family and his possessions and go back home, but he had neglected to take into consideration the relationship Laban had with Jacob's wives and children. It was time to be firm in the decision to go back home. The consideration for Laban would have made the situation more acceptable. The ideal would have been for everyone to get along without conflict. However, there are always different perspectives, personalities, and priorities. Even among Christians, these sources of friction can break out in the heat of conflict. Often these conflicts produce emotions that blur our vision and blind our judgment. It's much easier to analyze a situation that took place thousands of years ago than to resolve a conflict with someone who irritates, agitates, and humiliates us now. When there is conflict in a relationship, the natural reaction may be to strike out or strike back at the person we are in conflict with. As Christians, we must recognize appropriate boundaries in our relationships to avoid harm to ourselves and to others. In part 3, it says, recognizable boundaries allow for peace. And the text is from Genesis 31, verses 51 through 55, which says, Laban also said to Jacob, here is this heap, and here is this pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. 2 decades of life together had taken their toll on the relationship of Laban and Jacob. Jacob had come at the suggestion of his parents to find a bride from among his mother's relatives. Laban was glad to give his daughters to his sister's son, but after 2 decades of each trying to get ahead of the other, it was time for Jacob to take his family and his possessions back to his native land. Before Jacob left to go back home, he and Laban made a covenant. Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, told his relatives to gather stones. They piled them up in a heap and ate there by the heap. Laban said, this heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. When you build a relationship with someone, you open yourself to being hurt. The more intimate transparent you are with a person, the more vulnerable you become to being hurt by that person. It would seem that the safest thing to do would be to not make yourself vulnerable to being hurt. However, you cannot experience all that is available in human relationships without intimacy and transparency. The closer a relationship becomes, the more both individuals know how to hurt the other person. As Christians, we need to be willing to set boundaries in relationships that say, I will not go past this place to hurt you, and you are not to go past this point to hurt me. Sometimes that covenant needs to be verbalized, and sometimes it just needs to be practiced. Relationships in many families, churches, neighborhoods, and workplaces would be strengthened simply by people agreeing not to intentionally hurt others. Even in the New Testament, Paul recognized that it is not always within our power to live peaceably with others. He wrote, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. But in any case, we can determine not to retaliate by crossing boundaries to hurt another person. In today's life application, it says that in human relationships, there is often friction with others due to different personalities, priorities, and perspectives. Sometimes the friction produces the heat of conflict. If you are experiencing such a relationship, do the following exercises, and as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with that person. Take time this week to study Ephesians 4, verses 25 through 32, and list at least 12 ways to improve your relationships with others. Choose one relationship in which you are experiencing friction, maybe even conflict, and take the initiative to bring peace by applying the principles you discovered in the first point. Be sure to pray for that person before you approach him or her.